As America is sweating through the dog days of summer, its economy is heating up. Last month, even as the Delta variant exploded, employers did add 943,000 jobs to their payrolls. 16 months after the COVID recession officially ended, the unemployment rate has now fallen down to 5.4%. After the 2008 financial crisis, it took 7 years for joblessness to fall that low. And meanwhile, wages are rising, the labor force is expanding, and productivity growth is booming. But there's little question that the economic recovery is proceeding nicely. But what's contested are the policy implications of that fact. Does the recovery's strength validate Joe Biden's high-priced stimulus and the Federal Reserve's low interest rates? If so, does that mean that Congress should enact the rest of the president's ambitious agenda for increasing the public spending? And or the central bank should maintain a loose monetary policy, or so that we can keep the good times rolling? Or does it mean that public investment and monetary stimulus are no longer necessary, and that we should now normalize interest rates and pare back the deficit and let the private sectors take things from here? This is the central economic debate on Capitol Hill from last week, and the focal point of that debate is inflation. Those who counsel an end to the high public spending and low interest rates generally do so in the name of the price stability. In their view, monetary and fiscal tightening is necessary to avoid overheating the economy. They point to the unusually high growth in the Consumer Price Index, also known as CPU, in recent months, and they insist that the time to get serious about inflation is right now. But last week, America's most powerful senator put one foot in this camp, and on Thursday, Joe Manchin, who's a closet Republican, implored the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell to taper the central bank's stimulus policy, saying that it's time to ensure we don't overprescribe the patient by further stimulating the already strong recovery. Now, others say that an economy in which millions remain involuntarily unemployed is still quite sick, and that further stimulus is just what the doctor ordered. Among this contingent is J.W. Mason, who's a professor at John Jay University, and he's an economist at the Roosevelt Institute also. And Mason believes that the closet Republican Manchin's understanding of macroeconomics is fundamentally confused, as is the entire mainstream debate about inflation. The Intelligencer spoke with Mason last week about what the mainstream media gets wrong about inflation, and how dubious abstractions disguise the anti-worker basis of the orthodox economics, and why socialists should find encouragement in the first 7 months of Biden's presidency, among other things. In some ways, the problem is actually the way of thinking that is behind the coverage. The problem is this notion that inflation, the change to the overall price level, is something more than or distinct from an average of the particular price change that we're seeing for particular goods and services for particular reasons. I think that this is one of the fundamental sources of confusion that some people have. But people have this idea in their head that somehow the overall change in the price level must be driven by a force other than the myriad things that are driving up particular prices. But this isn't the fucking case. But here is all that inflation is. You take all the prices that you can observe, and you average them in some way, and there's debatable choices you have to make, and then averaging them and designing your standard basket of goods and services, and that's inflation. And then and also, because where does that mistaken idea about inflation, that is something more than an average of various price movements for various goods, come from? I think it comes from an old-fashioned vision of the economy, in which the amount of money in circulation is fixed by an external force. If you imagine that there's a fixed amount of money in the economy, and that the stock of money determines the overall spending, then particularities don't matter much. Individual businesses and households may make particular choices about what to spend money on, but the overall spending level is not determined by their aggregate spending decisions. It's determined by a larger force and the amount of money in circulation. Today, even mainstream economists reject that picture of the economy. There is widespread recognition that there is no tight link between the growth in the stock of money and inflation, and the textbook view is now that inflation is caused by too much spending and not too much fucking money. The distinction is important, and more money is just more money, but spending is always spending on a particular thing. In your recent essay on the inflation debate, you suggested the old-fashioned view was not always wrong, or at least that there had always been historical context in which excess currency production was indeed the key river of inflation. And of course, Mason said that's right. But what's distinguishable or contemporary context from those historical incidents? If you look at the historical hyperinflations that we've experienced before, those really are cases where the basic machinery of taxing and spending has just profoundly broken down. The private financial system is profoundly broken down, and you really do have government spending financed by printing currency, more or less literally. Even then there are always historically specific nuances. If, for instance, the hyperinflation in Germany after World War One, was really about a political response to the French occupation of the Ruhr Valley. In any case, there is no correspondence between the economic problems of the Weimar Republic and those we face today. Inflation right at this moment is exactly two things. We're seeing a big increase in the price of fossil fuels, gas, obviously, but also heating oil and so on. And that's just one. And two, we're seeing an increase in the price of automobiles, which is driven, I think, by some degree, if any supply chain can issue what they call the plus pent-up demand, and that's it. That is 100% of what we are calling inflation today. Neither of those phenomena has anything to do with the money supply. They have to do with factors specific to those particular two sectors of the economy. It doesn't mean that they are not important, or that they don't impose hardship on people who are paying those higher costs. But to think of this as somehow being related to something about money printing or the deficit, it's just fucking silly. And in any other context, we would recognize that whatever is setting the price of used cars, it's not the Federal Reserve or the federal budget, it's something specific to that industry. It seems to me that there are clear policy implications here, but if our conversation about price increases isn't focused on specific goods, but rather on the average price movements of all goods, then we're held liable to see a large increase in that average area as a demand side problem. Inflation is going to go up no matter what, so we need to reduce spending and credit to creation. By contrast, if we look under the hood and focus on which prices are actually rising, we're more likely to see the same phenomenon as a set of discrete supply-side problems. Car prices are rising because a shortage of the semiconductors is slowing production, so we need to invest more in semiconductor manufacturing. And this is exactly right. We just think of inflation as this undifferentiated thing. And then we think, okay, there's too much spending relative to the productive capacity of the economy. And so we have to have less spending, or else there's too much money chasing the amount of stuff we have, so we need to have less money in circulation. But that really has nothing to do with problems that we're facing now. It would be like saying rents are rising too quickly in New York City, and that's creating hardship on people. But let's make subway service worse until we bring the number of people who want to live in New York into line with the number of people who can be accommodated in housing at reasonable rates. I think anybody would agree that would be a terrible way of managing a housing problem in a city. But we actually do precisely that when it comes to inflation. And no one would say, look, we're facing supply chain problems in the auto industry, so let's raise interest rates to make it harder for businesses to invest in increased capacity, or let's say housing costs start to rise and that pushes up inflation. But would it make any sense to say housing costs are rising, so we need to raise interest rates, thereby making it more expensive to build a new housing? And yet, because we don't talk about inflation in concrete terms, because we just talk about it in the abstract, we actually do approach it in that absurd fucking way. I do feel like there are some less absurd, or at least less obviously absurd, arguments for seeing inflation as a phenomenon distinct from the sum total of various price movements. But in the discourse, I think inflation is often used as shorthand for the demand conditions that produce self-reinforcing, accelerated increases in prices. But one example is the wage push inflation narrative. If the consumer demand exceeds a certain threshold, then labor markets will grow so tight, workers will have the power to extract wage increases in excess of their productivity, and employers will then respond to higher labor costs by raising prices, and workers will respond to price increases by demanding still higher wages and setting off a vicious inflationary cycle. But the textbook story, as you say, is the story of the Phillips curve. It says low unemployment improves the bargaining position of workers who are in a position to demand the higher wage. And that's a realistic amount of things as so far as it goes. But I don't have a problem with that, and I think that's true. But the second part of the story says that higher increase firms the overall cost. That too is often true, but then the story says that that the businesses raise prices exactly in line with the rise in wages. Not always true, even on that part, which is really significant because it implies that the very tight labor markets are not actually good for the workers. It may look like they are getting wage increases, but in real terms, they really aren't. Inflation will eat those gains, and then, as you say, the final part of the story is that there's a federal back loop in which the workers who still have the bargaining power to demand higher wages do so to keep up with the cost of living. I think that there are three questions we should ask ourselves. One is it actually the case that the labor markets are so tight and that they're generating the very large wage increases, and that's an empirical question, and we can all debate that. The second question is unemployment unsustainably low in the sense that we are trying to employ more people than the economy has ever had available? And the answer is absolutely fucking not. But the third question is, what actually happens when you have accelerating wage increases? The assumption of the textbook story is that 100% of workers, then the wage gains get passed on into the prices. The ideal being that prices move up and down in lockstep with wages, and there's absolutely no reason to think that that's not fucking true. In fact, there's overwhelming evidence that it isn't true. The textbook story just assumes that the division of income between wages and profits can never change. In other words, it assumes that the wage increases never come at the expense of the profits, and thus owners, they always come at the expense of consumers. And yes, that story is right on point. When wages go up, prices rise faster. And wages rise more slowly, prices rise more slowly. So nothing ever happens to the real wages. But in the real world, when the economy is booming, wages do rise and prices don't. Or they don't rise by as much. And in periods of stagnation, and wages remain stagnant, or they fall and prices do not. In the real world, we've seen big movements in the share of the national income going to workers as opposed to the owners over the past generation, but mostly down, but also up during short periods of tight labor markets and low unemployment. So the idea that every change in wages gets passed on one for one to prices is refuted the moment that we look up from the textbook to the world around us. It's clear then that the tight labor markets can enable workers to secure real wage growth, and that wages in that context can rise faster than prices. And therefore, if you say that policymakers must never tolerate the accelerating wage growth or allow wages to rise faster than productivity, what you're really saying is that we can't have an increase in labor's share of the national income. We can't ever have a situation where the share of the pie going to workers is getting bigger, and that's what the target actually means in practice. And there are some people who like that, and that's maybe why we have it as an implicit policy goal. But plainly stated, it is not a platform that people are going to consent to in the remotely democratic political system. The ultimate conclusion here of your critique of the inflation discourse is that the anti-inflation policy should aim at identifying the supply constraints as much as or more than restraining demand. And what would an inflation policy that prioritized the identification of supply constraints look like? More to the point, once the policymakers identify existing supply constraints, what precisely should they do? The first step is always to admit you have a problem. And the thing that I want to convince people of right now is that a raise in interest rate is absolutely not the appropriate response here. It's very destructive, and it doesn't even address the real problem here. But the point is that there's a lot of prices, and they rise for different reasons, and there's not going to be one set of tools. If the fossil fuel prices are rising very rapidly, we're in luck, because we definitely know how to fix that problem, and we need to become less reliant on the fossil fuels. But we've got a lot of tools in place to try to move in that direction. We just need to deploy them faster. And what I fear is that people will see this inflation and say, "Oh well, I guess we got to scale back on our plans for investment in decarbonization." And when that price data is actually showing us is that we need to transition faster away from the fossil fuels, because aside from destroying the earth, which is the fundamental thing, it also introduces a lot of instability into the economic system, because the price of these fuels is extremely volatile. In your writing, you emphasize that mainstream economists know that the Econ 101 textbook view of things is wrong. They know that there is no tight link between the money supply and inflation, or that economic booms have historically produced real wage gains. And yet these obsolete paradigms still inform their policy conclusions and cause them to look past massive logical flaws in their high positions. These mainstream economists are generally intelligent people, but what do you think sustains the dissonance between their theoretical premises and policy prescriptions? The political convenience is obviously a factor. If you admitted that tight labor markets actually are effective at, redistributing income from profit to wage, and that the slack labor markets redistribute from wages to profits, you would bring the question of the income distribution into the political arena. And I think that one of the successes of what we might call the neo-democratic model of politics was to move those questions off stage. But I suppose the people who see that as a positive thing would say that these are such disruptive questions and they're hard to negotiate, and it would lead to a much more zero-sum adversarial kind of politics, and so better to take it off the fucking table. But separately, I think a lot of economists are drawn to an abstract, formal kind of reasoning when there are questions that you can find a unique, optimal answer to, and you don't have to think too much about history or institutions. And so if you say 100% of the wage increases get passed on to price changes, that's very simple. If you say, well, it's actually divided up in a complex fashion, depending on a variety of conditions, and that model of the world doesn't give you simple, timeless answers, it doesn't lend itself to a neat formalization. But I think with the economics profession, that's certainly a factor, but it's a little bit of a puzzle, to be honest, because as you say, once you actually start thinking about the stuff the logical problems with the Orthodox story are pretty glaring. And speaking of the problems with the Orthodox story, you and Mike Conzel recently published a report from the Roosevelt Institute arguing that the Congressional Budget Office's estimate of the size of America's potential labor force and the number of workers available to the economy, given optimal policy and conditions, is of about 28 million, if not higher, which has major implications for inflation. But if our labor supply is much larger than we realize, then the amount of demand our economy can absorb without suffering high inflation is much larger too. So how did you arrive at this enormous figure? Yes, this concept of the potential employment is fundamental to a lot of our macroeconomic debates, and how fast can we grow. In many ways, it comes down to how many jobs can we add, how many people are there potentially available for work, and what is the full employment numbers. The way that we conventionally measure that is to look at how many people we're looking at some recent high water mark. Let's say we pick a year. Let's go back to 2005. Look how many people were working that year and declare that full employment. Then typically you make some adjustment based on the aging of the population, since we know older people are less likely to be employed, and that's kind of where you stop at. The problem with that approach is that it assumes our recent best is the best we could ever possibly hope for. It presumes that we have not been systematically fallen short of the full employment. But if you want to at least be open to the idea that potential employment is significantly greater than what we've seen in recent history, you need a different approach. One natural thing you could do would be to look at other countries, but we thought it would be interesting to try something a little different. Basically take a look at different groups within the United States. The employment rates vary a lot by various demographic categories and in ways that are hard to attribute to a different willingness or capacity to be engaged in paid work. And these demographic disparities vary systematically with the state of demand in the economy. And when demand is high, the gap between the employment rates of favored groups and disfavored groups comes down to a narrow point. Now we're talking here about potential. If you want to know how fast a car can go, you don't look at how fast it goes on average when driving in traffic. You look at the fastest speed you've actually seen it sustained on the open highway. So if we want to know what fraction of people in a given age group can be expected to work, we should look over an extended period and see, well, how much have people in that age group worked at various times in the past. As it happens, older people, and this may or may not be a good thing, but older people today in the United States are working at higher rates than they've ever worked before. But younger people are working at much lower rates than they have in the past. It seems to us that, first of all, if you want to know our economy's potential employment, you shouldn't just assume that the decline in employment among younger people is irrevocable. It can't all be because they're playing video games in their parents' basements or whatever, because most people don't have basements anyway. What about the rising rate of college attendance? Couldn't that reduce employment among young people and relative to the past in a permanent way? There is some of that, but a lot of people in college do work. And if you look at the people who aren't in college, there's fewer of them working too. So clearly there's something else going on here. Then there are big gaps by gender and by race and employment. I think it would be hard to defend the notion that the reason so many fewer black Americans are employed than white people of a similar age is because black people are not as willing to work, or because they have no capacity to do paid work. On the other hand, we have overwhelming evidence from the micro surveys and controlled studies that employers have a strong preference for white candidates over the black people with the similar credentials. So it's natural to conclude that when you have a slack labor market with more job applicants than jobs, employers are unfortunately just going to hire the white workers, but black people are at the back of the line for hiring. If we want to think about the full employment, then we can ask ourselves, what would it look like if we had sufficiently full employment that the employers reached the back of the line and people who are disfavored because of their race started getting hired at the same rate as the white people? And then you can do the same analysis with gender. The education status is more complicated because in some cases, educational attainment is really germane to the employability, but the employment gap between people with only a high school degree and college graduates has varied a lot over time. It was much lower around the year 2000 than it fucking is today. And again, we have evidence at a micro level that employers, when they have the opportunity to do so, they will prefer college graduates even for jobs that under the other circumstances they be perfectly able to hire the high school graduates for these type of requirements. So let's not say that high school graduates will ever be employed at the same exact rate as college graduates, but let's just say that the gap between those groups shrinks to what it was in the year 2000. So you make those adjustments and you end up concluding that there's an enormous amount of additional labor out there. But people had argued earlier that orthodoxy serves to suppress the zero-sum political conflict, but I actually think that there's an overriding implication of your work, and that there is immense opportunities for the non-zero-sum games in the U.S. economy. You argue that America's labor force and thus its productive capacity is far greater than mainstream models presume, and you suggest that America can realize its full productive capacity through the supposedly politically easy task of giving ordinary people more spending power. And rather than exhausting a fixed supply of resources and high demand can actually increase the labor supply. So there's this politically painless way to make all Americans much wealthier, and yet for decades after decade we've been choosing not to do it. And why do you suppose that is? There's only three answers to this. The first is that if you subscribe to the orthodoxy, then you simply don't believe that there's all this additional, what they call productive potential that's going on, and it's going unused. And in that case, the distributional questions really do become as zero. And answer two is the one that the Polish economist Michael Kalecki gave a long time ago, and that the various people on the left and on the Democrat side have picked up since, which is that for business owners and their political allies, status and authority are ultimately more important than the volume of profits. And it isn't just the way that they prefer a bigger slice of a smaller pie. They want to be in charge of the pie. In a very tight labor market, employers might on a dollar and cents basis benefit more from greater sales than they lose to higher wages, but they would also be losing authority in the workplace if people were no longer afraid of losing their job. Answer three of this is just that it requires doing things differently, and political institutions have a lot of inertia, and people aren't comfortable being told that the thing that they believe for a long time isn't actually true. And we've had this sort of scarcity mindset for a long time, and it's familiar to people. I think that we do have the potential for vastly higher employment and vastly higher levels of production and vastly higher material living standards for people than we have today. But that requires a lot more spending and a lot more demand in the economy. And it doesn't require only that. It also requires reorganizing the way that we do things. We may need to adjust the workplace hierarchies. We may need more centralized decisions about how investments get made, which people aren't necessarily comfortable with. Housing scarcity in the U.S. is one headwind to go with. And of course, if you build more housing, we all know that there's always people who find that very threatening. So I think that there's just the element of inertia that we shouldn't underestimate here. But in a way, the pandemic and the climate crisis offer an advantage to the reform, and those are forces big enough to potentially break us out of some of that inertia. Months ago, in the wake of the American Rescue Plan's passage, you wrote that the stimulus bill struck you as a decisive break with neo-democraticalism, and it doesn't, and that it really does seem that the one on that on the big macroeconomic questions, our side is winning. Have you grown more or less confident in that assessment since March? Hold on here. Um, um, Obviously, there's been a lot of back and forth, and there's a lot of things one would wish had been done better. But that's already been but what's already been done is extraordinarily positive. I think that there is a real problem on the Democratic side of not giving sufficient recognition to how much better the response to the crisis has been than our responses to past crises are. I think some people are still looking at it through the lens of 2009, which really did fall short in profound and fundamental ways. But back then, the focus was on rescuing the banks. Nothing was done to maintain incomes and employment for working people, but nothing at the necessary scale. I think this has just been right the night and day compared with that, and I think that really has to be acknowledged, and not to be fair or to give credit where it's due. They're big boys; they don't need our fucking credit, but so that we can actually build on this and do more of it. We can't build on something until we acknowledge that it's a foundation, and the big challenge is to make programs like the pandemic unemployment insurance permanent. The key thing about the neo-democratic turn is its critical victory. It was not changing people's minds about what was desirable. It was changing people's minds about what was possible. And that was the whole thing. There was no alternative to it. It doesn't matter whether you think the government ought to do certain things. It just can't. The pandemic experience has really just proven that. It's proven that actually government can do a lot more than we think. And actually it can do pretty well. We don't actually have to have mass impoverishment, eviction, and hunger every time the economy enters recession. We can actually maintain the people's access to the necessities of life. We didn't do it perfectly, but we do it so much better than we've done in the past, and that sets a new benchmark for what can be done in the future. Operation Warp Speed did the same thing. Obviously, it's not good that the vaccinations that yielded are protected by private patents. They should not be the private property of some business, but nonetheless, it's very clear that there was a public commitment to do this. Public resources were invested, and it really worked. And once you open the door and show that these things are possible, it's very hard to go back and convince people that they didn't see what they fucking thought they saw. The cat is out of the bag. Our government can actually solve problems, but I don't know. Maybe I'm just being optimistic, but I think that it's very hard to turn the clock back now. So if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RVW King, and also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out, and thanks for listening.